I knew something was wrong the moment my husband told me it would be better if I stayed out of sight tonight. The words sounded gentle when Daniel said them over the phone that afternoon, but there was something underneath them that felt heavier than politeness. "It's just a big corporate party, Mom," he had said, his voice careful, like someone choosing each word before letting it out. "Olivia's been working hard on her image at the company. There'll be executives there, investors, you know how those things are." I didn't know how those things were, though maybe not in the way he thought. By the time I arrived at the Grand Hudson Ballroom just outside downtown Chicago, the parking lot alone told me this was the kind of evening people spent weeks preparing for. Long black sedans lined the entrance, and men in pressed suits were stepping out beside women wearing dresses that probably cost more than my first car. I had worn my best navy dress, the one I saved for weddings and church holidays, and I even had my hair done at a small salon near my neighborhood that morning. At 67, you learn not to expect the world to notice you, but I still believed a family event meant family. When I stepped inside, the room glowed with crystal chandeliers and soft gold lighting that reflected off polished marble floors. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling drinks, while a quiet jazz band played somewhere near the stage. For a moment, I stood there alone, searching for my son's familiar face among hundreds of strangers. When Daniel finally saw me, he walked over quickly, but not with the warm smile I had expected. Instead, he glanced around the room first, as if checking who might be watching. "Mom," he said quietly, leaning closer to me. "I'm really glad you came, but maybe it's better if you relax in the lounge area for a while." He gestured toward a smaller seating space near the far wall, half hidden behind tall decorative plants. I looked at him, waiting for the rest of the explanation that never came. "Olivia's greeting the executives tonight," he added quickly. "It's kind of important for her career." Important for her career. Those 4 words told me more than he probably realized. Still, I nodded and walked toward the lounge area he pointed to. The music sounded softer there, and the conversations from the ballroom faded into a distant murmur. From my seat, I could see the center of the party clearly. Olivia stood near the main table in a shimmering silver dress, laughing with a group of sharply dressed guests. Daniel joined her a moment later, placing a supportive hand on her back. Not once did either of them glance in my direction again. As the evening grew louder and the room filled with applause for speeches I couldn't quite hear, I realized something slowly settling into my chest. I hadn't been invited here to celebrate. I had been invited here to disappear. I knew something was wrong the moment my husband told me it would be better if I stayed out of sight tonight. The words sounded gentle when Daniel said them over the phone that afternoon, but there was something underneath them that felt heavier than politeness. "It's just a big corporate party, Mom," he had said, his voice careful, like someone choosing each word before letting it out. "Olivia's been working hard on her image at the company. There'll be executives there, investors, you know how those things are." I didn't know how those things were, though maybe not in the way he thought. By the time I arrived at the Grand Hudson Ballroom just outside downtown Chicago, the parking lot alone told me this was the kind of evening people spent weeks preparing for. Long black sedans lined the entrance, and men in pressed suits were stepping out beside women wearing dresses that probably cost more than my first car. I had worn my best navy dress, the one I saved for weddings and church holidays, and I even had my hair done at a small salon near my neighborhood that morning. At 67, you learn not to expect the world to notice you, but I still believed a family event meant family. When I stepped inside, the room glowed with crystal chandeliers and soft gold lighting that reflected off polished marble floors. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling drinks, while a quiet jazz band played somewhere near the stage. For a moment, I stood there alone, searching for my son's familiar face among hundreds of strangers. When Daniel finally saw me, he walked over quickly, but not with the warm smile I had expected. Instead, he glanced around the room first, as if checking who might be watching. "Mom," he said quietly, leaning closer to me. "I'm really glad you came, but maybe it's better if you relax in the lounge area for a while." He gestured toward a smaller seating space near the far wall, half hidden behind tall decorative plants. I looked at him, waiting for the rest of the explanation that never came. "Olivia's greeting the executives tonight," he added quickly. "It's kind of important for her career." Important for her career. Those 4 words told me more than he probably realized. Still, I nodded and walked toward the lounge area he pointed to. The music sounded softer there, and the conversations from the ballroom faded into a distant murmur. From my seat, I could see the center of the party clearly. Olivia stood near the main table in a shimmering silver dress, laughing with a group of sharply dressed guests. Daniel joined her a moment later, placing a supportive hand on her back. Not once did either of them glance in my direction again. As the evening grew louder and the room filled with applause for speeches I couldn't quite hear, I realized something slowly settling into my chest. I hadn't been invited here to celebrate. I had been invited here to disappear. The music drifted through the ballroom in a slow jazz rhythm, while conversations rose and fell like gentle waves across the room. And from the lounge chair where I sat, I continued watching the celebration unfold as though I were observing someone else's life from a distance. Waiters passed through the crowd carrying trays of small desserts and tall glasses of sparkling water, and every few minutes another guest arrived at the entrance where a host welcomed them with a bright smile. It was the kind of event where every detail had been carefully arranged so that success looked effortless. Olivia moved easily from group to group, introducing people, laughing softly, and guiding conversations with a confidence that impressed everyone around her. Daniel stayed close beside her, occasionally leaning in to speak with a guest or nodding during a discussion about company projects. From where I sat, they looked like the perfect professional couple. Yet something about the way Daniel avoided glancing toward the lounge made the distance between us feel larger than the ballroom itself. After some time, the lights near the entrance brightened slightly, and a quiet shift passed through the crowd. Conversations softened and several guests straightened their posture as if responding to an invisible signal. I followed their attention toward the front doors where a tall man in a dark charcoal suit had just stepped inside. Even from across the room, I could see the change in people's expressions. A few executives who had been speaking near the bar immediately began walking toward him with welcoming smiles. Olivia noticed him at the same moment, and her reaction was immediate. She placed her glass on the table beside her and smoothed the front of her silver dress before whispering something quickly to Daniel. Within seconds, both of them were moving toward the entrance along with several other senior employees. I heard someone near the dance floor say quietly, "That is Mr. Caldwell." Another guest responded with an impressed nod and said, "The chief executive himself." The name sounded familiar even to me. Richard Caldwell was the kind of business leader people mentioned on financial news programs and magazine covers. He was known for building one of the most successful technology firms in the Midwest. Watching the crowd gather around him reminded me of the way students used to gather around a respected principal during school assemblies. There was a sense that his presence mattered. From the lounge, I could see Olivia greeting him with careful enthusiasm while Daniel stood respectfully beside her. Several others joined the conversation, forming a small circle around the executive near the entrance. For a while they spoke together while the rest of the guests observed from a polite distance. Eventually the group began moving slowly through the ballroom, as if Mr. Caldwell were being guided through the event so he could greet everyone. The circle of executives followed him step by step, while conversations paused briefly each time he stopped to speak with someone new. I watched this quiet procession with mild curiosity, never imagining that his path would come anywhere near the quiet corner where I had been asked to remain. Yet a few minutes later, as the group continued across the ballroom, I noticed something unusual. Mr. Caldwell suddenly slowed his pace and glanced past the decorative plants toward the lounge area. His eyes moved across the room once, then again more carefully, as if he had just noticed something unexpected. The executives beside him continued speaking, but he was no longer paying attention to their conversation. Instead, he was looking directly toward the place where I was sitting. For a few seconds, I wondered if I had misunderstood what I was seeing, because a man like Richard Caldwell had no reason to notice someone sitting quietly in a lounge corner. Yet his attention did not shift away. The executives beside him continued talking about quarterly numbers and upcoming projects, but he no longer seemed to be listening. Instead, he studied the room carefully, his eyes returning again and again to the small seating area near the tall decorative plants. From my chair, I could see the moment Olivia realized something had changed. She was standing near him with the same polished smile she had worn all evening, but when she noticed the direction of his gaze, her expression tightened for just a fraction of a second. Daniel followed her glance and then quickly looked away, as though hoping the moment would pass unnoticed. The group began moving again through the ballroom, greeting guests along the way, and I assumed that whatever had caught Mr. Caldwell's attention had already slipped from his mind. I looked down at my glass and took a small sip of water, telling myself that the evening would likely end soon enough and I could quietly leave without causing any discomfort for anyone. But a few minutes later, the low murmur of conversation around the room shifted again. I looked up and saw something unexpected. Mr. Caldwell had separated from the circle of executives and was walking slowly across the ballroom floor alone. Several people stepped aside to make room for him as he passed, assuming he was simply greeting another guest. Olivia noticed his movement immediately and began following a few steps behind, clearly unsure where he was heading. Daniel joined her, his expression uncertain. Meanwhile, I remained seated in the same place Daniel had asked me to stay, not realizing at first that the path Mr. Caldwell had chosen was leading directly toward the lounge. The closer he came, the quieter the nearby conversations became. A waiter paused beside a nearby table and two guests standing near the plants stepped aside as he approached the seating area. When he finally stopped a few feet in front of me, I looked up politely, expecting perhaps a brief greeting meant for someone behind me. Instead, he studied my face with a look of recognition that surprised me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his expression softened into something warmer, almost relieved. In a calm voice that carried clearly enough for the nearby guests to hear, he said something that caused several heads to turn toward our corner of the ballroom. "Margaret Whitmore," he said slowly, as though confirming a memory he had been searching for. "I have been looking for you." The words seemed to hang in the air longer than the music playing behind us. Around us, the small group of guests who had followed his movement fell silent. I noticed Olivia stop a few steps away, her confident posture suddenly uncertain. Daniel stood beside her, staring at the scene with visible confusion. Meanwhile, I remained seated, trying to understand why one of the most powerful executives in the room had just spoken my name as if we had unfinished business from long ago. For a few seconds, no one in the ballroom spoke. The music was still playing somewhere in the background, but the sound felt distant now, almost like it belonged to another room. Richard Caldwell's words had changed the atmosphere in a way I had not expected. The small circle of executives who had followed him stood quietly nearby, their attention fixed on the conversation unfolding in the lounge area. I could see the surprise on several faces, the kind of expression people wear when they realize an important piece of a story has been missing all along. Mr. Caldwell turned slightly so the others could hear him more clearly. "Most people only see the company we built after it became successful," he continued in a steady voice. "They see the towers downtown, the investors, the awards on the wall. But very few know how close we came to failing in those early months." A few guests nodded politely as they listened. "What saved us," he said, gesturing gently toward me, "was a strategy session led by Margaret Whitmore." I felt Daniel's eyes on me immediately after hearing that. When I glanced toward him, his confusion was obvious. He looked as though he were trying to rearrange everything he thought he knew about his own mother. Olivia remained silent beside him, though the calm confidence she had carried all evening had clearly disappeared. Meanwhile, Mr. Caldwell continued speaking with the quiet certainty of someone sharing an important memory. She was not even working in the technology industry full-time, he explained to the small audience forming around us. She was teaching literature at a public high school during the day. Yet she understood something that most business consultants at the time completely missed. A few people murmured with interest. I remembered those days well. After my husband passed away, I had accepted small consulting projects whenever they appeared, usually through old academic contacts who knew I enjoyed analyzing strategy problems. It was never meant to become a career. It was simply a way to keep my mind busy while raising Daniel and paying the mortgage on our modest house outside the city. Mrs. Whitmore helped us see that our company needed patience instead of speed, Mr. Caldwell continued. She told us that if we rushed to impress investors before our foundation was stable, we would collapse within 2 years. He paused briefly, then smiled. We followed her advice, and it changed everything. Several executives exchanged surprised glances after hearing that. Clearly, this part of the company's history had not been widely shared. I folded my hands gently in front of me, feeling slightly uncomfortable with so much attention. "It was only a few meetings," I said quietly. "Many people contributed to the company's success after that." But Mr. Caldwell shook his head. "Perhaps," he replied kindly. But there are moments when a single voice changes the direction of a decision. And those moments matter. He then looked around the room slowly before adding something that caused a new ripple of curiosity among the guests. For years I tried to contact you again, he said. We wanted to offer you a permanent advisory position after the company began growing. But by then you had stepped away from consulting entirely. I nodded slightly. Life had taken a different path after Daniel left for college, and I chose to return to full-time teaching until retirement. Business strategy had simply become a distant memory. Mr. Caldwell studied me for a moment before speaking again, this time with a tone of genuine respect. When I walked into this ballroom tonight, he said calmly, I did not expect to find the person who helped shape the earliest chapter of our company, sitting quietly in the corner of the room. Around us the silence deepened as several guests glanced from me to Olivia and Daniel, slowly realizing that the woman who had been hidden away in the lounge was not a forgotten guest at all. The silence around us stretched longer than anyone seemed comfortable with, and I could feel the attention of the entire nearby crowd settling on the small lounge area, as if a quiet spotlight had been turned in our direction. Richard Caldwell stood calmly in front of me, but the reaction from the others in the room was far more complicated. Several executives exchanged surprised looks, clearly trying to process the unexpected connection between the woman sitting quietly in the corner and the early history of their company. I noticed Daniel shifting his weight beside Olivia, as though the floor beneath him had suddenly become unfamiliar. For most of his life he had known me simply as his mother, a retired schoolteacher who enjoyed gardening and baking during the holidays. The idea that I had once advised a young technology startup must have sounded almost impossible to him. Olivia's reaction was even more visible. She had spent the entire evening presenting herself as a confident professional guiding an important corporate event, but now that confidence seemed to falter. Her eyes moved between Mr. Caldwell and me as though she were trying to understand how the quiet guest she had asked to remain in the lounge had suddenly become the center of the evening's most important conversation. Mr. Caldwell seemed to notice the tension spreading through the room, and his voice softened slightly when he spoke again. Mrs. Whitmore has always preferred to stay out of the spotlight, he explained to the executives standing nearby. But that does not change the fact that her advice shaped some of the earliest decisions our company ever made. A man standing behind him, one of the senior managers judging by the badge on his jacket, leaned forward with open curiosity. You mean the partnership model we still use today? He asked. Mr. Caldwell nodded once. Exactly, he replied. The idea that we should build trust with long-term partners before chasing quick investment opportunities. That was her recommendation during our strategy meeting all those years ago. The manager looked genuinely impressed and glanced toward me with a new kind of respect. Meanwhile, I felt a quiet mix of embarrassment and disbelief at how quickly the atmosphere had changed. Only 20 minutes earlier, I had been sitting in this same chair wondering if anyone in the ballroom even realized I was there. Now people were looking at me as though I had just stepped out of a company history book. I turned slightly toward Daniel and offered him a small, reassuring smile, hoping to ease the tension I could see in his expression. He did not smile back immediately. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, perhaps remembering the evenings when I stayed up late reading through thick stacks of documents at the kitchen table while he finished his homework. At the time, he had probably assumed they were simply school papers. Olivia finally stepped forward, her voice polite but noticeably careful. Mr. Caldwell, she said with a respectful nod. We are honored that you remember Margaret's contribution to the company. None of us realized. Her sentence faded before she could finish it. Mr. Caldwell glanced toward her briefly and then returned his attention to me. The truth is, he continued calmly, I have wanted to thank you properly for a very long time. He paused for a moment, then gestured gently toward the main ballroom where the central tables were arranged beneath the chandeliers. And I believe tonight is the perfect opportunity to correct something that seems slightly out of place. His eyes moved across the lounge area once more before he added quietly, someone who helped shape the beginning of this company should not be sitting alone in the corner of the room. For a moment the ballroom remained completely still, as if the entire evening had paused to watch what would happen next. Richard Caldwell's words carried a quiet authority that did not need to be repeated. When he gestured toward the main tables beneath the chandeliers, several guests instinctively stepped aside to create a path through the crowd. I stood there for a second, uncertain how to respond to so much attention. But Mr. Caldwell offered a warm, reassuring smile and extended his hand with a respectful invitation rather than a command. "Please," he said gently, "walk with me." I could feel dozens of eyes following us as we moved away from the lounge area and into the center of the ballroom. Only a short time earlier, that same space had felt distant and unreachable, but now people greeted me with polite nods as we passed. Some guests even whispered quietly to one another, repeating my name with curiosity as if they were discovering a small forgotten chapter of the company's history. When we reached the central tables, Mr. Caldwell paused beside the largest one positioned beneath the brightest chandelier. Several senior executives were already seated there, but they immediately stood when they saw him approach. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, addressing the small group with the same steady confidence he had shown all evening, "I would like to introduce someone whose advice shaped the earliest foundation of this company long before most of us imagined how far it would grow." The executives looked toward me with open interest as he continued. "This is Margaret Whitmore." The name moved through the table like a quiet ripple of recognition. One of the older managers smiled with clear respect and motioned toward the empty seat beside him. Mr. Caldwell then turned slightly and spoke words that seemed meant not only for the table, but for anyone still listening nearby. "Success rarely belongs to a single moment or a single person," he said thoughtfully. "Sometimes it begins with a conversation that almost no one remembers except the people who were there." I felt a gentle sense of peace settling inside me as I took the offered seat. Across the ballroom, I noticed Daniel standing near the edge of the crowd, still processing everything that had happened. Our eyes met briefly, and this time he did not look away. Instead, he gave a small nod that carried a mixture of pride and quiet apology. Olivia stood beside him, her earlier confidence replaced by a thoughtful silence as she watched the scene unfold. I did not feel anger toward either of them. Life has a way of revealing people slowly, sometimes through moments we never expect. As the music resumed and the evening's conversations began to flow again, Mr. Caldwell leaned slightly toward me and spoke in a quieter voice meant only for our table. "I am very glad you came tonight," he said sincerely. I smiled softly in return, glancing once more across the ballroom that had seemed so distant when I first arrived. Earlier that evening, I had believed I was simply a guest who needed to stay out of sight. Now, I understood something much simpler and far more important. Respect does not always announce itself when you enter a room. Sometimes it waits patiently until the right moment to find you.